Charles DeRudio, an Italian nobleman and a seasoned officer in the U.S. Army, fought in the 7th Cavalry during the fateful Battle of Little Bighorn. Captain Frederick Benteen, never one to hold back, mockingly referred to him as Count Number Account, due to DeRudio's tendency to boast in his aloof demeanor. Despite this, DeRudio was a capable officer, earning a promotion to first lieutenant on December 15, 1875, though he wasn't particularly favored by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong, Custer, and others. DeRudio was among those who survived the Little Bighorn and later penned his vivid recollections of the battle. "I barely escaped the death that met so many during the epic clash on June 25th and 26th, he wrote, detailing the unforgettable moments. That morning, at about 10 a.m., General Custer's scouts returned with shocking news. They had discovered a village of Indian people roughly 15 miles away, nestled along the Little Bighorn. They observed what seemed to be the native forces retreating from our approaching army. We advanced another couple of miles before General Custer halted us to discuss our plan of attack. He divided the troops. Colonel Benteen, leading companies H, D, and K, was tasked with clearing everything in their path to secure our left flank. Colonel Reno, commanding companies M and G, took the center position, where I found myself temporarily assigned to Company A. General Custer himself led companies E, I, F, L, and C on the right, with Company B staying behind to guard the packed train. As we continued our march, our center group was ordered to pick up the pace, trotting until we reached the river, about 6 or 7 miles away. Upon arrival, we crossed the river, emerging onto the wide plains beyond, where we formed a battle line. Galloping forward, we charged through the thick dust clouds stirred by the fleeing Indians, making it nearly impossible to see. Colonel Reno ordered the battalion to halt, and we dismounted to set up a skirmish line, the right flank positioned near a dry, wooded creek. The horses were led to shelter in the woods as the Indian warriors launched their attack, and we responded immediately with gunfire. The skirmish lasted for about 30 minutes. We soon spotted several abandoned lodges across the creek in a small clearing. Our line crossed to investigate but was met by the fierce yelping and shouting of nearly 200 warriors. Their relentless fire made it clear that retreating was nearly impossible, as we found ourselves trapped, entering the fight with only 100 men. Our small force was overwhelmed by the sheer number of enemies. As we crossed the creek, I was at the rear and noticed a guidon left behind. I went back to retrieve it, but it got tangled in the brush as I navigated through the trees. While I was attempting to remount my horse on the creek's southern bank, a bullet hit my horse, sending it bolting into the ranks of the Sioux. I found myself alone, with around 300 Sioux warriors only 50 yards away. They unleashed a barrage of gunfire, but somehow I was unscathed. I escaped to a nearby thicket, where I encountered Fred Gerard, the interpreter, and Private Thomas O'Neill of Company G. Like me, O'Neill had lost his horse. I suggested that Gerard and O'Neill stampede their horses to avoid giving away our position, but they refused. I crawled through the thick brush, hoping to remain hidden until nightfall. While hiding in the creek bottom, I heard several pistol shots nearby, followed by the unsettling sound of squaws' voices. Cautiously peering out, I saw these women engaged in the gruesome act of scalping a soldier who may have still been alive. They performed a war dance around the body, adding to the horror of the moment. As the fire spread through the dry woods, I was forced to abandon my hiding place. I crawled along the creek as before, but this time I heard a voice calling, "Lieutenant! Lieutenant!" After moving toward the sound, I found the group I had left behind. We all feared the advancing fire, but fortunately, the wind slowed, and a light rain began to fall, halting the flames. It was 3 p.m., and we anxiously waited 6 more hours until dark, all the while hearing the voices of Indians nearby. At nightfall, under the cover of heavy clouds, we made our move toward the ford, about 2 miles across the open plain. Gerard and the scout mounted their horses, while O'Neill and I each held onto a horse's tail, following through the darkness. The night was so black that we could barely see, though we heard the returning warriors. After crossing the river once, we realized we were in the wrong place and had to ford it again. While making our way across, we encountered 8 Indian warriors. The 2 mounted men fled, while O'Neill and I dove into the bushes. I cocked my revolver, ready to fire, but the warriors didn't pursue us, thinking we had all fled. Morning came, and the sound of cavalry troops nearing the river brought us hope. I saw men in military attire on gray horses, climbing a bluff. I even recognized someone in a buckskin jacket with a white hat, believing it to be Captain Tom Custer. Confident, I stepped into the open and called out, "Tom, don't leave us here." But instead of a friendly reply, I was met with a terrifying war cry and hundreds of shots. It was then I realized my mistake. The warriors had taken our clothing and horses, fooling me into thinking they were part of our command. The soldier and I quickly dove into the cover of the bushes, dodging the hail of bullets that shattered the branches with each round. We crawled, trying to escape the deadly fire, disturbing the upper limbs of the undergrowth, which led the warriors on the bluff to shoot in our direction. We made the decision to dash across a 20-yard clearing to reach the safety of another wooded patch. Before moving, I took a moment to scan the area. The sight was grim. About 50 yards to our right, I saw 4 or 5 warriors swiftly advancing. Close to me were 2 cottonwood stumps, nearly side by side, forming a rough shield. The soldier and I crouched behind them, he gripping his carbine, and I, my revolver, ready to strike if they got too close. They hadn't noticed us yet, and when the lead warrior was just 10 yards away, I fired. They had been riding single file, and my shot caused them to wheel around and retreat. Private O'Neill then fired his carbine, hitting the second warrior as he was turning his pony. The man dropped his reins, raised his hands, and fell to the ground. His journey had ended. The first man I'd shot at rode off a short distance before falling as well. The remaining warriors vanished behind the trees. The gunfire from the bluffs still echoed, but after our shots, it eased, and we retreated back into the thicket. From our hiding spot, we could see the warriors on the bluffs with their horses tethered safely below. Sharpshooters lay prone on the hilltops, their muskets cracking in the distance. The sound of battle echoed from above, with the familiar cheers of our fellow soldiers mixed with the gunfire of the native warriors. Our spirits briefly lifted when we heard the cheer of our comrades, but it soon faded as we realized the forest around us had been set ablaze, forcing us to move again. We crawled to the forest's edge only to find that the enemy had ignited both sides. We kept low until we found a dense patch of trees, under which we took shelter. The grass in this area was still green, thanks to a recent drizzle, and the lack of wind meant the fire crept slowly. I used my gauntlet gloves to smother the flames as they inched toward us. Soon, the fire had burned out, leaving us in a small circle of safety, hidden from view but with a clear line of sight to the world outside. We could see the warriors moving around, and one stood about 70 to 80 yards away, keeping watch over the fire. Around 4 p.m., he fired 4 shots into the air, what I assumed was a signal. Soon after, a warrior's voice rang out, shouting a call repeatedly. After these signals, we watched as over 200 warriors crossed the river and left the area. About an hour later, the same signal echoed through the air, and more warriors rode off on horseback, with the last of them soon following. A sense of hope returned as the gunfire slowed to an occasional distant shot. By 6 p.m., the area around us seemed calm, with no sign of any nearby warriors. We believed our regiment had left the battlefield and planned to wait until nightfall to cross the river and make our way toward the Yellowstone River. There, we hoped to build a raft and float down to the Powder River, where our supply camp awaited. We had gone 36 hours without food or water. At 8 p.m., we waded across the river, crossing it twice before climbing the bluffs. Carefully choosing our path, we moved slowly, covering 2 miles before I climbed a hill to survey the area. In the direction of our command, I spotted a fire about 2 miles away. Unsure if it was lit by warriors or our own, we decided to approach cautiously. We descended the hill, moving carefully toward the fire, stopping every so often to listen. After another mile, we stopped again at the top of a hill. This time, we heard voices, too faint to make out if they were friendly or not. As we moved closer, a familiar sound reassured us, the bray of a mule, followed by a challenge that had echoed through countless centuries. "Halt! Who goes there?" Though the challenge wasn't aimed at us, it gave us the confidence to continue. We were now only 200 yards from the fire when I called out, "Picket, don't fire." "It's Lieutenant DeRudio and Private O'Neill." We sprinted toward them, met by a loud cheer from the picket line and Lieutenant Varnum himself. Varnum, a brave and capable officer, rushed to greet me, overjoyed to find me alive, as he had assumed I was among the fallen. I immediately asked about the rest of the regiment, hoping that our losses had been minimal, but Varnum shared the grim news. There was no word from the 5 companies under Custer's command, and our unit had already lost Lieutenants McIntosh and Hodgson. Exhausted after 2 nights without sleep, I arrived at the camp around 2 a.m., but rest wouldn't come easily. I spent the early hours talking with Lieutenant Varnum, recounting the close calls and dangers we had faced. Morning came quickly, and I briefed the officers on the movements of the native warriors. By 8 a.m., we spotted cavalry approaching, first a few scouts, then a larger column. It was General Brisbane's command, coming to relieve us. Soon after, General Gibbon arrived with his troops. The sight of those blue uniforms filled our hearts with deep emotion. As Generals Gibbon and Terry rode into camp, even the most battle-hardened men wept openly. Private O'Neill's loyalty and bravery will forever stay with me. He followed my every command, standing by me like a true brother. His company commander holds him in the highest regard, and I too will always be grateful for his courage and friendship during those perilous hours. For that, I, Charles DeRudio, will always remember him.